Welcome to Lunch and Learn Copyright and Fair Use in the Digital Age. My name is Morgan, and I'm the Outreach and Assessment Librarian here at CCCC. You can see my email there at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to email me if you have questions. I'll be happy to provide some guidance and suggestions on this topic. I do want to present a disclaimer really quick. This presentation is not intended to replace legal advice in any way, shape, and form. The content of this presentation is meant to be informative, but does not constitute legal advice. If you have further questions about copyright in your specific situation, be sure you seek appropriate legal counsel. So I'm happy to provide suggestions, provide resources, but when you're thinking about what are the legal ramifications of copyright, particularly for your particular situation, should you have any concerns, you really need to seek outside legal counsel. The library is not a substitute or replacement of that legal counsel. The learning outcomes. First, I just want to help you understand the importance of copyright and fair use within the classroom and articulate the differences among copyright, fair use, Creative Commons, and public domain resources. And that is really what this presentation is. This presentation is an introduction to a variety of resources that you can use to help you determine how copyright works, and not only how copyright works, but also how you can use certain materials in your course in ways that are fair and reasonable in case you want to use copyright content. So, as I'm sure you are well aware, copyright is the legal protection of creative material. So copyright protects a variety of diverse materials, ensuring that the creator receives credit and often revenue for their work. This law protects the actual expression of the idea, not necessarily the idea itself. Essentially, you have a great idea for a poem. You think, oh, this is such a great idea. Copyright's not going to protect the idea because that exists in your mind. But once you write that poem down, that now becomes something that could be protected by copyright. Fair use is the means of using copyrighted material without having to ask permission or pay for the content. Creative Commons is an organization that provides licenses for sharing materials in order to comply with copyright law, and it helps make material available through diverse license agreements. Public domain refers to material that no longer falls under copyright. So these materials are available and can be used for anything, including profit, and you don't have to ask permission to use those materials. You can make money off of something from the public domain. Now, I want to clarify one thing. Just because it's on the internet, open to you, publicly accessible through the internet, does not mean that everything you see is in the public domain. When we say public domain, it just means that the material doesn't fall under copyright anymore. But you could reasonably look at a variety of materials online that are publicly accessible and available for a variety of purposes, and it still falls under copyright. Next, we're going to talk about fair use. There are 4 factors in fair use that you want to consider as you think through what material you can use. So you want to think about the amount of the material that you want to use. So if you find a copyright material that you would like to use, you need to think about the amount of that material you would like to use. You now need to think also in the second factor about the nature of the copyrighted material. So you find a piece of material that you would like to use and it is copyrighted. You want to think about what is that text doing. So it could be a novel or it could be a movie, and you want to think about what is this text doing, what does it contain, what is the material, what's the nature of that material. The third factor is the purpose for which you want to use the copyright material. So are you going to parody it? Are you going to use it for educational purposes? Are you going to transform it in some way that alters that content from its original nature. And then you want to think about the impact on the use of the market value of that copyrighted material. So essentially, if by making your own use of this copyrighted material, do you decrease how much money the original will make? Now, I want to be very clear, fair use is very, very complicated. So you cannot simply just say, well, I'm going to check off these 4 points and then never think about it again. You have to really dig deep into how you want to use the material and consider the 4 factors in detail. And that can be really challenging. So I found a couple materials I think will be helpful for you. I'm going to show you what those materials are. You have a fair use evaluator here. As you see here, this tool cannot provide legal advice for you, but you can use it as a kind of way that you can practice. And it's very useful in helping you think through the 4 factors in ways that make sense. And then there is another fair use checklist I'm going to show you here. You can see here, this is from Columbia University Libraries, and 2 authors by the name of Kenneth Cruz and Dwayne Butler have come up with this fair use checklist. And you can see here that the fair use checklist is very useful in sort of thinking through the purpose, like we talked about, the purpose of the material that you want to create. So what do you want to do with it? The nature of the original work, the amount that you want to use, and then the effect that it will have. So just keep in mind these 4 factors, but you can use this fair use checklist as a way to navigate your own understanding, but also if your material would even qualify for fair use of a copyrighted material, or if maybe it's one of those things that's kind of doesn't fall under fair use or wouldn't even be close to falling under fair use. So one thing that you want to think about is, let's say the material doesn't fall under fair use and you really do want to be able to use it and you want to incorporate it in some way into your classroom or into your own personal endeavors. You want to think about getting permission. So 3 steps to securing permission. Identify the rights holder. If you know the publisher, that's the best place to start, since most publishers have a very specific path that they want you to take when seeking copyright permissions. You can then request permission. Verbal permission is always good, but you really do need that signed legal letter. Most publishers and major rights holders are going to have a template or form for you to use. They, just like you, would not want to rely on verbal permission alone, and so they will often have ways for you to navigate that. Third, you want to keep a record. If permission is granted, you want to make sure you hang on to all the legal documentation that you have received, and make sure that that's in a place that you can get to it easily. Any documentation is very useful, so be sure that you hang on to that. Now, I got all of this information from our CCCC faculty and staff copyright guide, and I'm going to show you that information in a minute. So if you, for example, don't have these slides, that guide is going to be there so you can look at these steps one more time. They're very straightforward, but it is always good to go back to them and make sure that you've followed each of the steps. Now, another part of copyright is the TEACH Act. Now, this is very complicated, and it's one that I will have to say I do not know all the ins and outs of, but I'm actually going to provide you with some resources in case you're like, I really need some guidance on this. Of course, we can chat, but I think some of these other resources, which is going to include the Library of Congress, are going to be much more helpful in really giving you the ins and outs of the TEACH Act as it relates to copyright. So this TEACH Act is the Technology, Education, and Copyright Harmonization Act. And it's a revision of U.S. copyright law, and it applies to online and distance education courses. And essentially, it serves a really great purpose, which is it updates copyright law to remove any impediments to the use of technologies in teaching. So that comes from Cornell University Library, and I want to show you their guide because they have a really fantastic guide on the TEACH Act and copyright materials. As you can see, they have a lot of great tabs up here if you want to continue to explore that. That's always possible, but they have the understanding the TEACH Act and kind of going through what the faculty responsibilities are, the technological requirements are, institutional requirements, and then any exclusions. So this will walk you through it. Again, notice here, this is not necessarily something that you want to take as legal advice. It's educational in nature, just in the same way this presentation is educational in nature and does not constitute legal advice. None of these guides do, and none of these resources do. So be aware that you can use this, and we want you to use it, but it's not a substitute for legal advice. Here is our copyright and fair use guide. It's very straightforward. It's not quite as specific in detail, but here are some of these criteria for the TEACH Act that you can use. Again, not substitute for legal advice, an educational resource here. And then just like the fair use checklist, I found a TEACH Act checklist that may be helpful for you. Again, I know I keep saying this, but I really want you to know this is not legal advice. This is educational purposes alone. And so just keep in mind that you could use this as a way to kind of think through what it is that you want to do in your class. And if it brings up any questions, you can always decide how you want to address those, whether you reach out to a lawyer or you reach out to the college and for their guidance, or you reach out to the Library of Congress as well. Okay, there are a lot of new challenges when it comes to copyright and the digital age. And so obviously the TEACH Act really focuses on making sure that online and distance education courses are comparable to those in-person classes and making sure everybody has a full educational experience. And so there are lots of new challenges in the digital age, but I did want to bring one up that I think you probably will see quite a bit of in the future, especially because of the way things are changing. And you may have already experienced it, which is streaming services. Now that we're in an age where we don't really buy physical DVDs anymore, I don't want to say we don't buy them quite as often. We are now relying a lot more on those streaming services. So the way you can show movies in class or not show movies in class is a little bit more complicated. So the big thing I want to emphasize about streaming services is that you are bound by your license agreement. And so when you agree to your terms and services, whenever you purchase whatever streaming service you have, HBO Max or Netflix, you want to be aware that you are bound by that license. And so even if you were to purchase a material from the streaming service, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can show it in class. The way you would treat a license is different. A licensed material is different than how you would treat a DVD, the physical object that you hold in your hand. And so kind of keep in mind that even if you own and you pay for materials through streaming services, you are bound by whatever your license says. So go back and read through those licenses and those terms of agreement and see if you can figure out what terms you have agreed to. And so that can kind of be a good resource for you in figuring out what does my streaming service allow and what does it not allow. And so in the digital age, a lot of times we're not buying those physical objects anymore. And even though we have purchased it on whatever streaming service, again, we're bound by that license. So streaming services are great because they do provide ease of access to materials, but it is also a new challenge in the digital age because those physical objects that we used to have and buy so often are now being sort of phased out. And we're relying a little bit more on the internet and a streaming connection versus having something in hand. So the final sort of slide I want to show you is some information that might be useful and helpful for you. So first, I want to show you the faculty and staff copyright and fair use LibGuide. We've actually already looked at that. That is from CCCC Libraries, and that has some more information on there. Again, it's an educational guide, not a substitute for legal advice. And then HBO in Classrooms. This is very useful because even though HBO is a streaming service, they have a website, HBO in Classrooms, which provides access to materials that they have sort of made available to use in classrooms. And of course, they have certain requirements for each lesson that they have curated. I'll show you that now. You do want to make sure you read through all of their sort of expectations, but even though this is meant mostly for younger grades, it can be something you think about in lesson plans and working through some of the things that they have curated here. At the very least, it'll give you an idea of the differences between something like this that's available here, kind of a limited capacity, versus something maybe that you would have access to if you were streaming something. But again, you want to make sure you investigate this a little bit and figure out what works for you and what doesn't. And if you have questions about this, then you want to make sure that you investigate this website a little bit more and look at each of the things that you might be interested in. This is the best resource I can give you right here, the U.S. Copyright Office. I have actually had questions for them at some point, and they're great. You can actually contact them and fill out the contact information form, and they will get back to you very quickly. And notice here you can categorize your information based on what you need help with. And they also have lots of different information, like information about the law, as well as licensing and research. The LOC Teachers Program is also really excellent because this is something that allows you to contact the teachers who work with the Library of Congress and the librarians who work with them, and kind of working through the various aspects of bringing some copyrighted material into the classroom. And you can ask them some questions, especially if you have questions course, if you have questions about the Teach Act, the Copyright Office will definitely help you. But if you're really struggling with, I want to do this in my classroom and I don't know what that could look like, these folks have spent a lot of time working with classrooms and in classrooms and making sure that educators have access to materials and also creating lesson plans that are fun and engaging. And so even though they tend to work, again, with younger courses like elementary and high school, still, they can be very useful in guiding you in at least providing some suggestions for lesson plans and ideas. So, and I actually met a couple of these folks at ALA a few years ago, and they were really awesome, very welcoming, very positive. And so they're really very well equipped to say, hey, well, have you considered this? Or have you thought about this? So if you're kind of stuck, you're not sure what to do next, these folks can be really excellent about, if you wanted to use certain materials, but maybe you felt limited, they might give you some suggestions. Here is a copyright and fair use guide that is probably one of the best that I have ever seen. Again, this is not substitute for legal advice, but this is a really awesome guide that helps sort of help you think about the various aspects of copyright. Again, showing movies in class and on campus, copyright and online teaching. So they have a lot of really very, very useful materials on this guide. And I would encourage you to look through it when you had time. And then the copyright law from the Copyright Office. I'm not going to open that up, but that is a link to the actual law itself so that you can look through what are you legally bound by. And so there you go for that. If you want to read through that, not exactly like a super riveting read, but a very, very important one. And so be sure that if you have questions about what the actual law says, use that link and resource to look at the actual law. So we are now complete in going over the resources that I have here, but I've also made a handout that I will share with you, as well as the slides that we've gone over today. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the library, to me directly, or if you would like to talk more about the legal ins and outs of the U.S. Copyright Office, by all means, reach out to your legal representation or to the Copyright Office.